Hello and welcome to our first lecture for PBH435 Health Studies of Dangerous Drugs. So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about some basic concepts that will support many of the discussions that we'll have throughout the semester. So one of the very first things that we need to discuss, we'll start with the fact that many of us here in the United States use drugs on a daily basis, and we don't consider it dangerous drug use or anything to be concerned about from a health perspective. Some of them are even what we use to support our health. So when we talk about substance use and drug use, let's start being clear that we're not always talking about a health risk. If we take a look at the slides on the screen here, the images on the left, this appears to be a healthy consumption pattern. We've got people in a social setting. We've got what seems to be a positive mood. Seems to be someone there who's choosing to consume another beverage, so no peer pressure in action. You compare that to the scenario on the right, and we can see how the same substance in two different settings can mean very, very different things. So what we're talking about is who's using the drug, how much they're using, and when, where, and why they're using. And we can see very different answers to those questions just in those two pictures below. And as you think through your own life and experiences, I'm sure you can think of some scenarios where that would apply as well. So next, we're going to talk about 5 general principles of drug use. And these general principles are going to apply regardless of which drugs we discuss throughout the rest of the semester. And the first general principle, and an important one, is use is not abuse. If you think back to the pictures on the previous slide, we can point to one of those scenarios that seemed to be a use of the drug alcohol and one that seemed to be abuse of the drug alcohol. So even with the same substance, it's very common that we'll find patterns of use that are of health risk and patterns of use that are not. Second, every drug has multiple effects. We may look for one effect. We may be looking for only one of the ways that the drug will affect our body, but the reality is that every drug is going to affect other sites in our brain, other organs and organ systems in our body, and there's no drug that we know of that just has a single effect on a single brain site or organ system. Another important principle, amount matters. Doses that are larger, doses that are more frequent, or doses that cause, or consumption methods that cause a faster onset of the drug's effects. All of these can produce different effects than drugs at smaller, less frequent, or slower consumption methods. Our fourth general principle, our own personal history and expectations affect the drug-related effects that we'll experience. We can see this in the concept of tolerance, that an experienced user is going to feel differently after consuming a drug than an inexperienced user, and even our expectations, the things that we believe will happen after we consume alcohol or consume any drug, make those effects more and less likely to occur. When we get to alcohol, we'll see some interesting work that's been done with that. And then finally, drugs themselves, drugs are not good or bad. Drugs are inert chemicals sitting on a shelf. Now they definitely can cause negative or sometimes positive effects in our lives, but the drugs themselves, these are simply chemicals, and if we try to attribute good or bad to these substances, then we're ignoring all the factors that contribute to a healthy or unhealthy relationship or experience after consuming the drug. So these 5 basic principles, these are going to support all of the conversations that we'll have about drug use and abuse throughout the semester. So next we're going to define some important terms, and we're going to start with that very first one, drug. So this is a really, really broad category. We need something that covers everything from ibuprofen to nicotine, caffeine to heroin. And this is the definition we'll use for that broad category. Any substance, natural or artificial, other than food, that by its chemical nature alters structure or function in a living organism. So you can think about, if we took out that other than food phrase, we can think of foods like sugars that would really fit that definition. So that's why we include that other than food to exclude those and keep this category focused on the substances that we'll be discussing this semester. Next, an illicit drug. Now these are really easy to categorize. These are drugs that are illegal to possess or use. So some drugs, say like alcohol, they can be illicit at a certain age and then legal at another age. So we'll talk a little bit about that, actually quite a bit about that later in the semester. The next category gets a little bit more complicated, and that's deviant drug use. So deviant drug use is actually defined by social norms. We're talking about drug use that isn't common or is looked down upon within a certain social group. And I'd be willing to bet that in our class here, we have people who come from families where any consumption of alcohol is considered deviant, and then people who come from other families where alcohol consumption is considered well within the bounds of their social norms. So deviant drug use can be difficult to define. We also have drugs like peyote that have been used in some Native American rituals for millennia that have now become illicit based on current law here in the United States. But even that law can be subject for interpretation. Recent Supreme Court decisions have categorized peyote as legal for ceremonial uses, but not for recreational. So the same drug, the same person, and even different circumstances can change that category from legal to illicit. And then finally, drug misuse. And here we're talking about use of those drugs in different amounts or for different purposes than for their original purposes. Than their original intent. So continuing to define our important terms, now we're going to move on to drug abuse. The definition we'll use here is use of a substance in a manner, an amount, or in situations that cause social, occupational, psychological, or physical problems. So this gets broad. It can mean different things for different people, but in general, we're talking about a use that is problematic. So when the use of the drug begins to cause problems. And then finally, drug dependence. So note that we're not using the term addiction here. Addiction is a term that's come to be very widely used in our society. We talk about people being addicted to their phones, addicted to chapstick, and we're really talking about something very different when we're talking about drugs. So we're going to talk about drug dependence here in class. And this is that state in which an individual uses a drug so frequently or consistently that it would be difficult for the person to stop. So it's important to note that this may not be physiological. It may be the person may have a physical dependence on the drug, but it may actually be psychological dependence as well. And when we look at all of the symptoms that go with that condition of drug dependence, we define it as a behavioral disorder. So note that we don't have a definition here for dangerous. And basically that's because all drugs, whether they're prescription, whether they're illicit, or whether they're over the counter, can be dangerous to some of us. Tylenol can damage your liver under certain conditions. You could have an allergic reaction to a prescription that your doctor has recommended for you. We know that there's a strong relationship between nicotine consumption and lung cancer, and then some non-physiological reactions. We know that alcohol consumption can be linked to personal safety concerns. So all drugs can be used in a manner that is dangerous. So we tend to think of drug abuse in the United States here in the 21st century and before us in the 20th as a uniquely modern American situation and problem. But the reality is that drug use is pretty much as old as recorded history. Throughout history, we have seen drugs being used for enhancing spiritual experiences, for treatment for illnesses, and we've seen some major economic roles for opium trading routes and that kind of thing for drug use as well. Some changes here in the modern period, we've seen the rise of legal drugs, of the prescriptions and pharmaceuticals that we take for a variety of purposes, and then also this thing that we call the war on drugs, the legal efforts to prosecute drug use and drug users. So just a couple of visuals on that history of drug use. This is actually a depiction of drug use from an Aztec civilization in the 13th century. You can see that the figures in the picture are clearly enjoying something that they're smoking. It seems to be kind of a relaxing nature. So we don't know exactly what it was, but we know that whatever it was that they were consuming is something that we would now today consider a drug. And this is actually a depiction of drug use in the Egyptian pyramid, so even earlier. And actually when mummies have been analyzed for chemical traces, there are reports of traces of cocaine, hashish, and even nicotine in mummies. So clearly not a modern American problem. Of course, we do have questions about what drug use does look like here in the 21st century United States. So we try to conduct surveys and collect data on who's using what and when and how much. It turns out, though, that this is a pretty difficult question to answer. It's not easy to find out how many people are using, and it can be especially difficult when we're talking about illegal drugs. And even when we're talking about legal drugs, where there may be social stigma against consumption, such as tobacco or excessive alcohol use, people tend not to be entirely honest with us when we ask our questions about their habits. We do send out those surveys pretty regularly, though. They're awfully easy to use, and they tend to be pretty inexpensive and easy to reach a broad population with. We do see some drawbacks, though, when we try to use surveys. Is particularly among younger populations. So first of all, if we're trying to reach student populations, we tend to do those surveys in a school setting. Now, when we do that, we're automatically missing any students who may have dropped out. And those, of course, tend to be young people who are at higher rates or higher risk for higher rates of drug use than students who have remained in the school. And then we also have the problem of inaccurate self-reports. People tend to lie when we ask them about their drug use patterns, and we can't even predict which way they do lie. Some people exaggerate and some people minimize. And it can depend a lot on the setting in which the survey is conducted and who they expect are going to be able to see the results. So we conduct these surveys pretty regularly because of their ease of use and their inexpensive nature, but we don't always know how accurate the data we're getting will actually be.